Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Telling the story of your brand can help build a deeper, more emotional connection with your clients and customers. It helps you stand out from competitors and is much more likely to encourage word of mouth. As well as an expert storyteller, Gabrielle Dolan is an international keynote speaker, educator and author of several books, including Magnetic Stories, Connect with Customers and Engage Employees with Brand Storytelling. Done well, she says, a story can directly boost your bottom line. And to illustrate the point, Gabrielle shares an example with Chris Ashmore.
When I was researching for the book, I came across Archie Rose, which is a gin distillery. And they're actually a relatively new company. They started only about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was when they went into lockdown in March, they were really concerned because they had 15 bar staff and they were potentially going to lose their job. So instantly they made a decision to change from making spirits to making hand sanitizer. And in 3 days, they had changed their production, they'd designed and printed labels, and they'd made 7,500 hand sanitizers. They went on to make over 100,000 bottles of hand sanitizer, which not only kept their 15 staff employed, but they were able to employ an additional 15 staff in the region that had lost their job in the hospitality industry. When they started to share that story, so when that story got out, it got like global attraction. They were all over the world. And they said that that story, within a few months, they had doubled their database. They went from 50,000 to 100,000. Their social media activity had increased 30%. And they believed that their brand awareness had been escalated about 12 to 18 months. And for a small business and a young business, that one story just did amazing things for their company. Now, they clearly didn't do it just to create the story, but they actively shared the story to get those results.
And why is it, do you think, that a story like that helps generate extra business? Why do people want to buy when they hear a good story?
Yeah, look, I think why stories are so powerful because they tap into emotion. We often talk about what the business does. We can talk about how much we've done and what products we do, but it's not emotion. And the power of a story, why they work, is because it taps into emotion. And as humans, we're emotional people. And yes, we like the logic and it all needs to make logical sense. But people in traditional sales roles will tell you people buy on emotion and they justify on logic. And that's what a story does. It taps into emotion.
Well, in your book, Raoul, you outline 5 types of brand stories. Could you walk us through each one?
When I started researching the book, I didn't know what type of brand stories I'd come up with, but I sort of knew there would be categories. And they did eventually fall into 5 categories. And one is what I call the creation story. Now, this might be the typical founder story or your origin story. And it's either how the company was created, so how it started, or how a product was started. So, for example, the story I just shared about Archie Rose, that's a typical example of how a product was started if they continued to make hand sanitizer. So you've got this creation story. A lot of the times that's the only story companies share, but you need to move beyond that. I should also say a timeline of your company is not a story. So if you're sharing a story about how the company started, make sure it's like why we did it as opposed to when we did it. So creation story is one. Another type of story is culture stories. So how your employees are living and breathing the values of a company. So to me, a culture of a company is the values. So the stories people are sharing that demonstrates those values. The other one is customer stories. So these are stories about your customers, but you've got to move beyond testimonials with this and just talking about our products and services and the great things we did for our customers and make the customer the hero of the story. One of the companies I researched and write about in the book is the oldest restaurant in Florida. It's called the Columbia Restaurants. It's a 5th generation restaurant and they share wonderful customer stories. For example, on Valentine's Day this year on their social media, they shared the story about this couple that had spent their wedding anniversary every single time at Columbia restaurants for 52 years. And so they went there the first anniversary and they went back their second anniversary and coincidentally got the same table. So Columbia reserved that table for them every single year on their wedding anniversary. And what I love about that story, it's a story about a customer, but by default, you sort of go, well, this must be a pretty special restaurant if that couple keeps coming back to it. So it's making the customer the hero of the story. And then the other two are community stories. So again, what are you doing in the community? But it moves beyond your corporate social responsibility, and perhaps it's stories about your employees doing really good things in their community. And the other type of story is the challenge story. So how have you responded to challenges? And we've seen a whole lot of them come up over the last 12 months, but it's looking for variety of stories, Chris.
And these stories, are they the responsibility of anyone, or is it mainly the CEO or the owner or those in the leadership roles? Or can anyone tell these stories?
Yeah, so my premise around brand storytelling that it's everyone's responsibility. I think one of the mistakes companies make is they think it's the marketing department and the marketing department just have them come and find the stories. But the reality is your frontline staff are in a position to share stories with their customers. Your frontline staff are actually also in a position to create stories, like to do something amazing that then will have your customers sharing stories. So to me, it's everyone's responsibility. I guess like anything, the leaders can probably take a more significant role. So the CEO and the leadership team can take a more significant role in finding these stories and sharing these stories. But once all your team understand the power of stories, that's when they will actively find these stories and then find opportunities to share them, both internally or externally.
Where do brands go wrong when they tell stories, do you find?
Yeah, they go wrong in a few places. I think one is, I sort of spoke about earlier, they're not sure what a story is. So they think a timeline is a story. So we'll go, oh, our story. And when you look at it, it's just a timeline, which is not engaging because it's not emotional. I think they also go wrong in just focusing on one story. So just focusing on that founder story or that creation story. But I think ultimately, and maybe they don't go wrong here, it's just a missed opportunity where I see so many organisations that have really, really great stories that they should be sharing, but they don't. And I think it's a missed opportunity, and they're not sharing them because either they don't understand the power of them or they don't quite know how to tell the story. So one of the reasons I wrote the book is I saw so many of those missed opportunities of just having great stories but just not sharing them.
And do you have a process or a formula that you suggest people use to share stories?
Yeah, so look, I guess the whole process of implementing brand storytelling, for want of another better word, is being really clear on what your brand is. So what do you want to be known for? There is this process of educating all people in the organisations around the power of stories, so what I just spoke about. But then it comes this process of where do you find stories and where do you share stories and how do you create them? Almost like this cyclical process of collect, communicate, and create. And I think when it comes to communicating, so where you can share your stories, you can be really creative. So, on your website's an obvious one. Induction programs, I think induction programs should have lots of culture stories about employees living the values. Don't be afraid to use them in written newsletters or emails to your staff. But, you can get really creative. I've seen one of the companies I interviewed for the book is the Fullerton Hotel in Singapore, and they actually produced a book for their 100-year anniversary on stories. Another company I interviewed were Ferguson Blair Bakehouse in Australia, and they share stories a lot, but they share stories on their coffee cups, like their little micro stories. I've even had a company that has shared stories on shoes. Now, granted, they were a shoe company, but it's just finding these stories and figuring out where you can share them on your internal channels, on external channels, and just be creative. Don't be afraid to be creative.
Well, finally, Raoul, there seems to be a real embrace of storytelling in recent times, but You've been banging the storytelling drum for many years now. Why is it becoming so popular these days?
I think what's changing is several things. I think people are realising that the way we communicate with just facts and figures and data doesn't actually work. Like, it's not as engaging as and effective as it was. I think there's a whole generation that are making purchasing decisions, as in what I buy or also who I work for, based around their own purpose and their own values, and they're looking for greater alignment between our own personal values and the company values. So companies need to communicate those values, and you can do that by living your values, but by sharing stories. So you can't communicate values with bullet points and data. And I think more recently, Chris, this human connection is critical more than ever. So I think there's a lot of reasons that are almost coming together to say storytelling's needed now more than ever.
That was business storytelling expert Gabrielle Dolan. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.